I'm delighted to be introducing our speakers for this evening's program. We have two of them, as you already know, from what Laura was saying during her introduction. I'll start with Kevin. Kevin Philip Williams is a naturalistic gardener and designer. He has a master's degree in public horticulture from the Longwood Graduate Program, affiliated with the University of Delaware. He also has a bachelor's degree in history and the philosophy of science, which I would like to learn more about. Sounds fascinating. Before coming to the Denver Botanic Garden, he did a horticulture internship at the Brooklyn Botanic Garden and worked as a gardener on the High Line in New York. Michael, and I forgot to ask him how to pronounce his last name, so hopefully he will tell us. I think it's Guidi. Also works at the Denver Botanic Garden. He's an ecologist and a horticultural researcher. He has a bachelor's in biology from Ithaca College and a master's in ecology from Colorado State University. Before coming to the Botanic Garden, he was a field biologist. Both Michael and Kevin are avid proponents, and I'm sure you'll hear more about this through their presentation, avid proponents of dynamic, self-sustaining gardens that reflect both natural as well as urban spaces. Through their work at the Botanic Garden and through this beautiful, highly informative book, they seek to broaden the definition of gardens and gardening. So take it away, Kevin and Michael.
Hey everyone, thank you so much, Carol. That was a wonderful introduction, and thank you all for being here with us tonight. I'm just going to get our screen up and shared. We know you have a lot of choices on a Thursday night, so being with us really means a lot. By way of clarification, I'm Kevin, and this is my colleague Michael, and we get the honor of being here with you tonight because we got a little bit obsessed with shrublands, and it kind of, you could say, broke our brains, but really in a good way. And we ended up writing this book called Shrouded in Light, where we extol the beauty and the ecological complexity of shrublands, and we explore some philosophies and strategies to kind of help better appreciate them and understand their lessons and really use them as inspiration to create dynamic and resilient gardens and spaces. Michael and I both grew up in rural upstate New York and eastern landscapes kind of like this, where deciduous forests are interrupted kind of mostly by small towns and abandoned farms and kind of these old agricultural meadowlands. And this is where our ecological, our horticultural, our aesthetic training really kind of started amidst this really lush sea of green. And our eyes really were first trained to see these types of dominant plant communities and landscapes. But our minds got blown absolutely wide open when we moved out to Colorado and we started our Western explorations. And we both had the same kind of amazed, visceral reaction to our new surroundings. We were absolutely shocked by the beauty and the starkness of this environment. And it was just so much different from what we knew, but it was also so dramatic and compelling. The forests and the fields that we were used to were just replaced by this endless tapestry of shrublands on scales that we could barely comprehend. In our new home on the steppes, we were knocked out probably first and foremost by the shimmering light red silvers of rabbit brush and sand sage. And further into the Great Basin, we just felt scrubbed and smudged by the endless and endlessly aromatic sagebrush sea. As we kind of explored and climbed through the brutal escarpments of the Southwest deserts, we dove into this world of defensive succulent scrub and xeric resinous shrubs. And we were just stunned by the bold, kind of colorful scrub nestled into the Martian-like landscapes of the dry desert forest that surrounded these areas. And even in wetter mountain biomes, we just kind of felt crushed by these lush avalanches of shrubs that flowed down the mountains and wrapped around these eternally crumb-holzing evergreens. And Colorado has tons of 14,000-foot peaks and 13,000-foot peaks, and really so much of our exploration involved hiking and hiking up to these. And even on top of that world in the alpine tundra, we kind of found ourselves stepping around these tight cushions and mycelial-like expanses of subshrubs, all mixing together to stabilize the young rubble there. And these vistas and our immersion into the shrublands of the Western US was just absolutely life-changing for us. Their undeniable and really pervasive presence sort of activated these shrubland recognition systems in our brains. And this is where I say our brains broke, is then they kind of broke open, and our old patterns of perception were really shattered and expanded here. Because humans are pattern seekers. Our brains have something called a neocortex in them, which accounts for about 80% of our brain weight, and it's full of these neuron clusters called pattern recognizers. Evolutionary, evolutionarily speaking, humans are hardwired to really seek out patterns. We love being able to find and depend on patterns in our day-to-day life. Because once we figure out or we're taught a pattern, a formula, a rule, our brains really look to apply it everywhere. In these 4 pictures on the screen right now, you can see how the lichen could become linked to the salt stain, who has this intricate branching structure that we can kind of see in the shrubby necroarchitecture of that old roost there, which can also remind us of a black metal sigil. We take the random information of the world and really we project meaning out onto it. And in this way, we actually kind of hallucinate our reality a bit more than we receive it. And this tends to make pattern suggestion an incredibly powerful phenomenon. So we want to show you this video clip as an example. It's from this televangelist show, which aired during the Satanic Panic era of the 80s.
To get critics even, or the skeptics, to show them what I'm going to do, I've actually taken the exact piece of tape that you just heard it off of, and I've reverse thread the machine, and I'm going to play that exact piece of tape backwards now. Okay, just
prove
to
that you've not doctored
I
it
have
in
not
any way.
doctored it in any way. All right, let's go ahead and start. Okay.
I heard something there.
All right, listen for I live with Satan, exactly. You might want to turn it up just a little out here on the floor.
Did you hear that?
I live with Satan. Listen again. Okay.
As I live with
How many in
Satan.
the audience heard that? All right.
Now let's get that vote on videotape here. How many actually heard that? All right.
All right. Let's go on.
We can't see your hands up, but I'm sure most of you heard it after you were suggested here. I certainly can't unhear it now after listening to this clip so many times, but I just think it's kind of incredible and, miraculous, if you will, that hearing this satanic message in what is actually pure gibberish. The song in question here is Stairway to Heaven by Led Zeppelin, which is by no means a new song. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. And the technique that they were trying to expose in that show is called backmasking, which has been deliberately done in many recordings, but specifically in this instance, it never was. So still a pattern was suggested and a pattern was found. And this can be really tricky, right? Pattern recognition is this really powerful adaptation. It helps us to survive, to find food, to avoid danger. It also informs most of our opinions, our preferences, our prejudices. And this extends even out to landscaping and the greater environment. And Michael and I love this Walt Stegner quote. We use it in the book, and we really feel its truth kind of reverberated throughout our own lives and our experiences. Stegner writes, we're creatures shaped by our experiences. We like what we know more often than we know what we like. In other words, right, we like what we've been exposed to, what we've been taught to see, sometimes what we've been told to like. And these preferences can often kind of blind us to or keep us from observing or accepting a lot of our surroundings, or even make us actively block out things that we're unfamiliar or uncomfortable with. And this is also especially true regarding landscapes and gardens. This is why immersion, exposure, inspiration can be such powerful tools and profound experiences. Those moments when we're kind of pulled out of our routines, when we're forced to see the world differently and really invited to engage with something unfamiliar, can really help us break through the noise, wake us up, reshape the way that we think, that we feel, that we connect, and really remind us that sometimes the most meaningful insights can come from the most unexpected places. And for Michael and I, this often comes in the form of our personal and our professional travels. This unexpected place was just a roadside on the side of California. Do you remember the road?
I don't.
No, it was when we were on our way out to Yosemite. We saw
Yep.
this beautiful cistus flowering, and pulled over among the broken glass and barbed wire was just this insane beauty for us. As any passionate kind of gardener or plants person knows, we can never really turn our plant brains off, right? And in our case, we kind of started seeing shrublands everywhere, right? Even on the side of the roads. And we really found ourselves kind of lost in this huge intercontinental hedge maze. We saw their perseverance in the wind-blasted Tuckamore and the vibrant heathlands of the New England coast. And we scraped our bodies against the pungent sclerophyllous scrub of the famously biodiverse South African fynbos. We saw the brilliant fall colors of the Devil's Club, Oplopanax hardis carpeting the rain-drenched forest floors of the Pacific Northwest, and great thickets of roses and briars really reclaiming and healing the land and regrowing in the wake of agricultural abandonment. We had the thorn chicken wire mesh euphorbias of the Grecian Frigana, one of the oldest and most anthropogenically impacted environments on the planet. And the fire-dependent oak scrub, which occupies breaks of inland forest barrens, walk through rich heathland tapestries of temperate Europe, and the acid dip spiny trip of the Patagonian Monte scrub in South America. We saw Appalachian mountain balls of cranberry, rhododendron, and blueberry just crawling over granitic mountain caps, and the arid acacia woodlands of the Australian outback. We witnessed the glossy leaves really lighting up the open understories of deciduous forests, and on the opposite end, this bristling darkness really exposed by intense and persistent radiation in our deserts and steppes. We met impossibly ancient shrubs as big and as tortured as humans, and tropical thorn scrub that could easily torture humans. We walked through shrubland communities more expansive than any of our cities, and we examined these minuscule worlds of nano scrub, really tight and self-contained, totally easy to walk over, yet holding the very building blocks of our earth together. Really, we saw shrublands everywhere. We saw shrublands in places called grasslands. We saw shrublands in national forests. We saw these complex and important ecosystems, both holding their own definite spaces and also kind of ambiguously weaving into others. And we really had to ask ourselves, why did it take us most of our lives to see these patterns? Why do shrublands often go so underperceived? And where are all the shrubland gardens?
This invisibility that Kevin's talking about, in part, might be because shrubs are understudied creatures compared to their herbaceous and arboreal relatives, and therefore kind of largely misunderstood. So the whole categorization of plant forms into herbs, shrubs, and trees is an ancient one, dating all the way back to Greek philosophers, and it's remained largely intact since, but not without a lot of constant and significant debate. Even though it's vague, the definition of a shrub usually reads as something like a multi-stemmed, wood-producing plant, usually smaller than a tree, but that doesn't hold much weight since most plants can be forced into multi-stem states. Lignification and the production of wood is often an effect of climate, and size expressions of plants are often resource dependent where that plant's growing. But clearly we've all been in agreement that there's something distinct and intermediate about them. We tend to know them when we see them. Or do we? Part of what Kevin and I wanted to explore is how far we're willing to push our perception of a shrub based on these ancient definitions. Are clonal trees that are connected by running underground root systems considered more shrub-like than tree-like? We come from the state of Colorado. The aspen's tree status here is sacrosanct, but how does it significantly differ from so many cherry species or prunus, which kind of straddle that edge of a shrub or tree phenotype? Or on the opposite end of the growth spectrum, on the right hand of the picture, Raulia is this map-forming, multi-stemmed woody perennial from the southern hemisphere. Is it really any less of a shrub because of its size and the expression is so different than our traditional notions? Since shrubs are living, evolved products of their environments, maybe the best way to understand them and discuss them isn't through these archetypal physical forms and definitions, but through the survival adaptations that those forms actually offer the shrubs themselves. So things like their multiple stems allows them to spread out biomass, hedging their bets against damage, unlike trees, which tend to put all their resources into one primary stem or leader. Some are built to resist fire, others accept fire. Some will harbor animals, others want to repel animals and repel us. And shrubs also have some of the deepest root systems of any plants on Earth, unlike grasses or herbaceous perennials, which often draw from the top maybe 12 inches of soil. Shrub root systems commonly draw anywhere between 18 inches and 10 feet into the soil profile. And these deep roots combined with that persistent woody tissue above ground make shrubs really excellent at sequestering carbon from the atmosphere. Despite trees getting all the attention, research has shown that wild shrublands from the Mediterranean all the way to the alpine tundra are capable of meaningful carbon capture and storage. And even anthropogenic shrub systems like the vast traditional hedgerows of the English countryside have been shown to be net carbon sinks. Many shrubs also run. They are rhizomatous, they colonize open space. And by keeping all those growing points or meristems right at ground level, shrubs have adapted to withstand all sorts of environmental disturbance, things like fire and grazing. And shrublands like these that we call shrub meadows, they're really these snapshots in time, loaded with the potential to challenge the ecological ideas like succession. In a wetter climate, given sufficient years without disturbance, persistent shrubby, woody bodies will form, but in years of high disturbance, their presence might be quite sparse or at scale with the herbaceous vegetation that surrounds them. And these are all adaptations to extreme conditions, and shrublands usually found in very extreme environments. And we think this is worth paying attention to because in this era of profound global strangeness and climate change and extreme weather, shrubs are really doing just fine. Willows are advancing across the melting tundra and permafrost. And as hurricanes erode our coastal dunes in the absence of buffering estuaries, wax myrtle's putting down its roots and stabilizing the soils. And as wildfires increase in frequency and intensity, shrubs are filling in those voids. Pictured here is a 17-month progress of a shrubland regrowth after the 2019 Cape Fire in Los Padres National Forests, not too far from where you all are. And flannel bush outside of a Yosemite burn scar, and Areodictyon putting on an absolute super bloom after the 2017 Thomas Fire. Resprouting manzanita, seen here on Dry Lakes Ridge, 14 months post-burn, already putting on tons of biomass and healing the landscape. And Ceanothus maturing into this snag field after the Whittier Fire. These shrublands pictured here are the blueprints of the gardens for the future, and we really don't think that's a small thing or something to be ignored. Because resisting, adapting to, and recovering after all these acts of change and disturbance will be crucial for helping to pull ecosystems back into supportive states. And, shrubs themselves are caretakers of all life. Shrubs have some of the highest animal biodiversity outside of the tropics, and that's partially owing to that complex woody vegetative structure that we've been talking about, which allows them to harbor high numbers of plants and animals. That persistent and branched form does all sorts of things, like slow the air in the boundary layer around their leaves. It casts diffuse shadows. It creates these microclimates of higher humidity and rich duff. And when birds, mammals, and other creatures kind of scurry, eat, and defecate there, they drop seeds and fertilizer at the base of those shrubs, which now kind of act as a natural nursery. And this so-called nurse plant phenomenon is a real ecological phenomenon and is observed first between the desert shrubs mesquite and creosote and the saguaro cactus in the Sonoran deserts of Arizona. And since then, it's been identified in shrublands all over the world. And it's been shown that these facilitative effects, in contrast to that competition we hear so much about, are really crucial for maintaining diverse ecosystems. So in productive times, plants out under the shrubs kind of flourish and spread out into the greater landscape, but in harsher times, the shrubs continue to act as refuges for the species, even as maybe the greater plant community suffers. So All of these traits and kind of characteristics of shrubs and shrublands lead us to this interesting phenomenon, which is that inherent in the natural aesthetics of shrubs and shrublands are the aesthetics of life. And by accepting them, we also think we're accepting a deeper understanding of what beauty is, beyond just what makes us as humans happy.
To make something really beautiful, we need to think about what other beings find beautiful, what they find useful, what attracts them. We really need to make and encourage non-human spaces, even if those things might make us feel a bit uncomfortable. There's these feelings of discomfort, hesitancy, unease. They're kind of common, real emotions that we often face in wild spaces or places. And this is partly what makes these places exciting and thrilling and full of potential. But unfortunately, we don't often intentionally invoke these feelings in our gardens. In fact, we tend to actively avoid them, right? There's a dialogue that gardens are spaces for healing, for comfort, and for pleasure. And while those things are very true and very important, we also need to make and allow for gardens that kind of connect with a deeper spectrum of human emotions. We need to be able to validate the greater ranges and states of being inherent in the human experience in gardens and really celebrate that they're places of growth and change the same way that we are. Because complex, complicated, and challenging gardens kind of force us to face them as others, kind of independent entities that aren't just architectural fodder, but really alive with their own intentions and secrets. And shrubs and shrublands are a great entry point for having this different conversation and introducing this idea into gardens because shrubs are weird creatures, right? With really weird social properties. An idea that we play with in the book is that shrubs are an intermediate growth form. There's something in between. They're an idea that's both real and imposed. And like so many organisms, they exist along a spectrum of thoughts and realities. And to define them is to kind of misrepresent some of their true characteristics. Shrubs occupy this certain space in the world. It's not really the space of the floor that we walk over or the space of the floor that we walk under. It's the space of the floor that we walk with. Shrubs are human-sized humanoid vegetation, right? If forbs or herbaceous plants are kind of fodder that we walk over, and trees are these gods that we exist under, then shrubs are kind of our equals. And what do you do with that? It can be kind of intimidating. But shrubs can be gangly and awkward. They can be cute. They can be monstrous. They can be beautiful, inspirational. And because they exist in scale with us, kind of reflecting some of our own qualities, they're also able to inhabit this perceptual phenomenon known as the uncanny valley, and where the more human something looks, while not perfectly approximating us, really the stranger it can make us feel. But we'd often face this, right? We tend to kind of deny or erase this property of shrubs by making them unrecognizable through pruning or shearing, kind of taming them into these cartoony, easier forms, leading them to become the famous green meatball, right? Or the architectural foundation planting, really forcing them into this strange, isolated zoo creature-like state. In order to really see shrubs, to accept them as living creatures with their own sort of lives, we need to bring them home and put them back in the context of the shrubland. Still, this can be challenging for us, and honestly for many of our gardens, right? This isn't necessarily the easy solution to acceptance. It might just be a necessary thing that we have to do, since shrublands can also be perceived as difficult places, right? This can be described as challenging and tangled and illegible. This is a rhododendron thicket in West Virginia. And although many people love rhodies and azaleas, and they're widely embraced in especially traditional horticulture in their national communities, they know nothing about ultimate size growth or plant spacing requirements. They grow together quite thickly. They're considered almost impenetrable wastelands in some of their native habitats. And in fact, they're referred to as rhododendron hells by early American colonists. Landscapes like this, though, more open, sort of comprised of sometimes lower scrub, which you might commonly encounter in maybe drier or montane or coastal habitats, really haven't even fared much better in our perception of them. Agriculturally, these are perceived as unproductive ground, right? They're trash plant wastelands, they're fire hazards, they're too woody to graze, they're too thick and thorny to navigate. They're often left open as common or public ground, right? Not even worth selling or owning. You're probably familiar with a lot of landscapes like this throughout the Western US, and that's one of the reasons why the Western US is mostly public land. because humans have approached most of these landscapes with the philosophy of changing them into something that we deem productive. And here you can see a shrubland changed into a productive land. And unfortunately, it's this history of management that's been one of the biggest reasons that we've never really embraced shrubland archetypes in our design landscapes, right? We kind of have this inbuilt narrative that they aren't places that hold a lot of value. We think that that's really distracted from the deep ecological connections, like Michael was discussing, and the stunning beauty and the enduring productivity of these shrublands. On the other hand, we've had a much easier time accepting, adapting grassland, forb-heavy, forbland, forest, and even savanna ecosystems into our gardens because they're mostly reminders of abundance. They conjure images of fire-regimented hunting grounds, shaded grazing grounds, these kind of agricultural and pastoral scenes that promise harvest and comfort and security. They're places that really exalt human control. But our memories of shrublands run deeper, right? They're just beyond the reach of our complete taming of the earth. They might be kind of more tied to this pre-agrologistic era, if you will, our states of hunting and gathering, right? Which was maybe a less stable time for humanity. But if we can really approach these landscapes through that lens, connecting to our roots and really recognizing the vital role that shrublands played in our survival and our evolution, then they can really reveal themselves as places of true abundance. Michael and I love this book. It's called Hedgelands by Christopher Hart, and it's absolutely brilliant. It delves into the largely forgotten practice of creating living mixed species woody hedges across the United Kingdom, which highlighting many of their benefits from providing habitats to supporting crop production. And he really makes this compelling case that we need to reclaim space for these complex biotic structures and really learn to live alongside them again. Hart also points out that these hedges are essentially standard analogs for the vast thorn scrub that once covered much of the UK and Europe for around 12,000 years, the past 12,000 years during the Holocene, which really only disappeared or changed because of human activity and the decline of megafauna. And if you'll allow me to draw a thread here for a moment, remember the slide from earlier when we were talking about the Satanic Panic and Led Zeppelin. This is the cover of Led Zeppelin 4, the album that had the song Stairway to Heaven on it. And this kind of country gentleman on the cover is carrying this load of firewood, which was most likely kind of harvested from this traditionally laid regenerative hedgerow, which Christopher Hart discusses quite a bit, which was a very common and reliable way to harvest firewood in a country that in the recent past had almost been completely deforested, but still had a very active hedgerow culture and a really tight ethnobotanic link with those types of coppices and shrub plantations, if you will. And while for now the thorn scrub might not engulf all of England anymore, in many places the land is still very much covered in these shrublands. And in our quest to help others see the shrublands that surround them, we found it useful to kind of break them down into two categories of these big shrubby occurrences, the model shrubland and the alternative shrubland. A model shrubland is a classic stable shrubland biome that exists where environmental conditions place plants under almost constant considerable stress, and landscape succession happens very slowly, if ever. For example, in the extreme pH ranges of heathlands, in the aridity of deserts, and sort of these overexposed coastlines all tend to be host to very stable, long-lived shrublands that cover huge swaths of continents. Alternative shrublands exist in more limited spaces, liminal conditions, or under shorter timescales. They're often nestled into or play at the edges of other dominant plant communities. These shrublands often depend on disturbance events like fire, flooding, or grazing to create extreme or abnormal conditions that tend to interrupt a stable state. The idea of alternative shrublands also embraces the plant morphologies that act like shrubs and form extensive communities, but might not often be recognized as such. And the West Coast has a wonderful diversity of both model and alternative shrublands, which y'all are no doubt more familiar with than us. In the plant slides you were showing before, I think we're blown away by some of the shrubs that you were showing in there. Just absolutely beautiful. But you know, first and foremost, when we think of California, we're probably thinking of the mixed chaparral, which just has this unmatched immersive quality. Really, nothing makes you feel more like an animal than really getting turned around in this scrub. You also have the coastal sage scrub, a knotted tapestry of things like buckwheat, coastal sagewort, coyote brush, blue blossom, running for over 1,000 miles along the Pacific coast. In many places, this coastal sage scrub has just as extreme an urban wildland interface as the chaparral does. This is a picture taken in Bruno Mountain, just south of San Francisco. You, of course, also have steppes kind of just beyond the Cascades and deserts just beyond the Sierras, which are world famous, right? And serve as archetypes for most Western drought tolerant gardening. And you also have wet understory thickets of things like snowberry and rubus and hazelnuts and grape hollies, which offer this incredible complexity and edibility that's currently lacking from a lot of our design landscapes. So how do we start making sense of these places for our home landscapes? How do we turn the shrubland into what we call the shrubscape? Now, one of the first approaches that we might take is kind of expanding our artistic and aesthetic touch points to really help us interpret the shapes and masses and strange actions that we find in shrublands. Artistically, shrublands have not always been well received, though. Monet, whose impressionistic works we reference so much in our kind of modern perceptions and appreciations of naturalistic gardens, right? You can't see a Pete Udolph design or the High Line without someone saying, oh, it looks like a Monet painting. It turns out that Monet had some real issues with shrublands, as you can read on the screen here of the Mediterranean maquis. Monet said it is too thick, and there are always parts with lots of details, a jumble terrible to render. And of course, I'm the man of isolated trees and vast spaces, right? Shrublands were really a challenge here. And in painting them, you can see that Monet was really forced to create this thicker, wilder impressionism, especially in the details, something that almost verges on deep abstraction.
We think abstraction is useful because the patterns and language of wild systems, like Monet hinted at, are often so intricate that they can appear to be unreadable or even chaotic, something that we have trouble patterning in our mind with our brains. So imagine trying to describe this scene on the right using only symbolic language, the language we speak and write with. So much would be lost in that description. However, these abstract, non-representational kind of meditative compositions like the one on the left here have impact just through their kind of tonal and spatial patterning and magic. Similarly, without even knowing the plant species on the right-hand picture, you can still feel kind of this energy and flow in that plant system. So we use this applied abstraction, which in our book we call extracts, to highlight the spatial patterning that underpins these shrubland communities and maybe help make us feel like they're a little bit more attainable in a garden setting. They're really just geometric simplifications, and they draw inspiration from Keith Haring and the neo-expressionist movement to iconically and dexically break down a scene into simpler components. And those components can be used as layouts to transpose the effect of a landscape elsewhere, like into our gardens. So for example, here, this is kind of a forced perspective, zoomed in shot of the California mixed chaparral. It's an incredibly steep hillside in Angeles National Forest, very varied terrain, in incredible plant complexity, but it's kind of hidden by that heavy western light and deep shadows of the late day sun. But by cropping the image into this abstract state, we kind of flatten it in this way that's reminiscent of maybe a site layout, and allows us to tease out into this, where a pattern, something like animal skin or camouflage, emerges. And using this, we can analyze the dominant plant players and their patterning with a bit more ease. We can see that chamise or adenostema is in the lead here. It's this uncomplicated hook that cuts through those heavy rifts of California buckwheat and black sage that mingle in and out of the chamise. And this technique, it can really be applied anywhere. It's this type of abstraction that offers a jumping off point, not just a simplification. So these are places that we can begin to think about these plant communities we see in the wild, their self-determined compositions, before diving deeper into the intricacy and chaos in those systems. And a great example of this in project form is Land's End Lookout. This is a public park in San Francisco by a design firm called Surface Design. And we really think it's this fantastic example of an urban shrubscape implemented by observing the spontaneous plant communities that surrounded it to inform a naturalistic design. And really kind of in a fairly abstract way, we think. And this allows for an uncomplicated initial planting of shrubs and interstitial forms to integrate into the existing wildlands that surround the park, and over time let one inform the other. And it's not only accomplished via the plantings, but also the architectural elements in well, which kind of recall the abandoned bits that can be found all over the site, which are now part of the greater environment and transcended their past original human purpose. Much like the spontaneous vegetation of the site, which is also invited to be part of the conversation, not just managed as some sort of interloping force. And this elevated garden kind of sets this process in motion, but it doesn't really dictate an ending. It allows for this surprise and change to happen over time.
And this surprise and change it's really so important in understanding and really implementing post-human gardens. Another tool that we use to translate wild spaces into our gardens, we call it wild systems emulation, which is this design technique that seeks visual examples of surprising actions to be the jumping off points for the arrangement of a design. And they can be the result of intentional or unintentional forces and really from any source. This really hinges on us redefining wild to simply means something surprising and really allowing us to open up our wild influences to a much wider range of sources beyond what we might just consider nature. And what we found is that using these snapshots of constantly changing systems like urban decay, graffiti, lichen colonies, or as you can see, even computer glitches to help guide the placement of plants and plant communities or architectural elements has this short-term effect of creating a garden that feels as if it's already in motion and the long-term effect of encouraging a competitive and changing space. And taking influence from these systems might seem pretty abstract, but that's kind of the point, right? Starting in a place with less personal control as a designer can really help us soften our expectations for a final outcome in a garden and really learn how to partner with these plants as they evolve to make a garden over time. We've applied the system of design to a number of sites in really very uncomplicated ways, essentially much like the shrubland extracts that Michael showed to you before. And so one of those places that we applied this is called Summer Home Garden. This is a public pocket park in Denver, Colorado, with a plant palette that's based on the shrublands of southern Colorado and the kind of greater desert Southwest. The garden layout here was inspired by a graffitied utility box using a technique called using the technique we're discussing, wild systems emulation. And this is just a radical object. It's been spray painted, stickered, wheat pasted, battered by the elements for years. You can see it's even as defiant as it says on it, the anarchy box. And the result is just this urban collage that no singular being or person or force could have planned. The layout was very simple. Plant groupings were essentially randomly laid out within the spatial suggestions of the markings. And the result was a very active and bright and immersive space that's just full of its own agency. It's a surprising garden with constantly changing forms and colors and textures that has a true wildness to it, even if it is somewhat of a false wilderness. The really funny thing about Summer Home is the owner will tell me all the time that she doesn't like some of the plant choices for the garden, even though she loves the garden as a whole. Right? Specifically, she doesn't like the rabbit brush and the Russian sage, right? She kind of thinks they're too common, too mundane, maybe even a bit too aggressive, but she kind of understands what the species do, what they provide for the space, what they provide for the wildlife, how important they are to the garden, and has come to, I think, kind of accept their presence. And to me, that's fine. That's a great starting point, kind of learning to coexist with and maybe even love something, even though it's different from you, right? It's important that the space isn't just pleasing to the owner or the gardener, right? That it still kind of challenges our idea of what a garden is or what it has to be, or that it's made just for us. That's kind of part of what we consider the anthropocentric apocalypse. And the beginning of post-human thought, right? The relinquishment of control, the decentralization of human importance, the lessening of our influence of the biosphere. And this is really a good thing, right? This is a good apocalypse. It's about learning how to live and accept and celebrate difference, how to partner with our cohabitants on this planet again. Another shrubscape that really sits at the intersection of communing with the environment and relinquishing control is called the LA Wave. This is a privately owned urban shrubscape that reimagines the intersections of Southern Californian coastal sage scrub with mixed chaparral. This garden was established with modified Hitchmowian methods, James Hitchmo of Sowing Beauty. We planted dozens of shrubs and sowed a full seed mix of annuals and perennials and grasses in a deep layer of sand, all with the intention of imbuing a space with as much potential for life as possible. This is a pretty radical departure from a lot of the sort of post-war turf and rose landscape of this classic Los Angeles neighborhood, and even a departure from the xeriscaped kind of succulent masses of modern times that you see out in a lot of these landscapes. And if you kind of look across the street in this photo, you could see the very typical scene of the neighborhood. So this definitely stood out quite a bit. And part of its uniqueness and rebellion is kind of the celebration of seasonality and, an area where you can kind of almost achieve endless summer with some of your plant choices, right? And the ability to keep your landscapes kind of static. But here, after the exuberant spring flowering, the heavy masses of shrubs above it kind of fade to hues of olives and golds in that heat and drought stress of summer. And the dormant grasses then really come into show here and act as lowlights for the shifting shades of the shrubby canopy above it. Technique and impulse and nonconformity were really the driving elements of the LA Wave. Together with the owner and caretaker, we shoveled 4 tons of sand into this front lawn while blasting Bad Religion and Ceremony from the porch. This is really a hardcore punk shrubscape at its heart. So Michael and I wrote Shrouded in Light in order to really expand the conversation of garden making and really highlight why shrubs and shrublands are such a crucial tool for kind of getting over ourselves in that process. Gardens don't have to exist at all, but we don't need to mess around with the landscapes that surround us or the plant communities that kind of persist in spite of us. But since they do, we should make them as weird as the world needs them to be and really as weird as they have the potential to be. So embrace your role as a gardener, as a human messing around on this earth, kind of creating beautiful things, sometimes creating ugly things, and above all, kind of, do what you want, live with intentionality. And as you kind of design and build and destroy the future gardens, the future nature cultures of the world kind of into existence, just consider for a moment the awesome partner that you have in the beauty, the complexity, and the perseverance of shrublands. Thank you all.
Well, that was a lot of food for thought. Amazing photography. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I haven't actually been to the High Line, but it sure echoes a lot of the photography that I've seen of their plantings and also a lot of the other naturalistic. But I think you guys seem to go a little bit further by connecting it with natural systems as well. That's really fantastic, especially for a lot of us here in Southern California that are trying to get our native plant ecosystems back into people's yards. It's like you saw the pictures of the lawns across the street from your little punk rock garden there. So it's interesting. You said a lot of your photographs show fairly large areas, though. So my question is, how do you translate that idea of wild shrublands to smaller areas? A lot of us don't live on mountainsides. Do you have any, is that in your book, or some information on how to kind of shrink that down instead of dealing with, 50 plants here and 100 plants here, maybe like 5 and 3?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a question we get a lot. And I think Kevin's LA Wave Garden is a great practical example of that. But I guess, one of our first instincts is to also point out we don't live in forests or in prairies for the most part either. And those are primarily the kind of landscape archetypes that serve to model most of the gardens we see in conventional areas and landscapes around certainly this country. So I guess the point is then, we can impose a meadow on a small footprint, which of course is, it's influenced by the vast, huge big skies and open spaces and the special kind of like feeling of that place, but it can be effectively imposed on a very small scale. And I think beyond that, the other thing that we talked about maybe at the beginning of the presentation was also, if you start to question the scale of shrubs themselves, it does open up more possibility for smaller physical spaces when designing gardens. So if a shrub could just be a subshrub that's like, 12 inches tall, or even a mat forming woody perennial that's prostrate on the ground, then you can shrub garden within a much smaller space without having to pick and choose those larger specimen plants that, like you pointed out, just physically you can only fit so many in a front yard.
So plant choice.
Yeah. If that makes sense. And shrublands do vary in scale. A book that we were really inspired by was Bringing the Mediterranean into Your Garden, which kind of looks at the Mediterranean garrigue communities in Greece and that region. And most of those shrubs are things that we almost think of as standard garden perennials, like lavender and rosemary. And so, but they're really shrublands. They're these woody plants that exist year round with that persistent branch structure. So again, maybe there's an intermediate kind of scale that could be imposed on a small lot.
Yeah, totally agree with all of that. And also, like you said, is it using 5 of a plant instead of 500 of a plant, or is it using 500 of a shrub and then managing it in maybe a way that you're not commonly managing shrubby material, but you're used to managing grasses or forbs. Something I think in Michael's slides, the shrub meadow, I think is a great example of that, of using these quick to regenerate shrubs like rabbit brush or
lead plant.
Or a morpho or lead plant or something like that. But doing hard coppices on it kind of all the time to keep the scale and even the growth kind of fresh and young in in your space.
Yeah, we've got a lot of comments of wow, amazing photographs, and then here come the gardeners. What was the LA wave home planting like maintenance-wise a few years out? Water requirements, trimming, etc.
Yeah, we see that. We'll pull up the chat too. So maintenance was pretty minimal, I would say, because of the deep sand planting. The owner had remarked to me several times that the weeding was very minimal, especially compared to his backyard gardens, which was sort of just plantings done directly into whatever the soils were around the home. So weeding was very low. Watering was water to establish during the first season, and then very, very minimal watering after that. I don't know how often he actually went through watering, but I think our recommendation to just not do it. Try to make the garden adapt to the natural cycles as much as possible. I'm trying to think. That went in December of 2017, I think. And the first big cutback that we did, actually, Michael and I did it this year in 25. We were out doing some talks in Los Angeles, and we decided to stop by and spend the day with the owner, doing a big cutback. The scale had grown pretty large for the site. And maybe if that had been done 5 years on, or 3 to 5 years on, as one sort of big, huge push, it would have stayed a little bit more in scale. But I haven't actually checked in on the regrowth process, but we saw a lot of resprouting and reshooting, happen a lot of the time. But I'll say that the homeowner, is a small business owner. He has a family, doesn't have a lot of time to go out and spend time in that maintenance regime, and the way that like we might sort of compulsively be hands-on in those spaces. And it still looked beautiful year after year. I think we visited to photograph it in 2023. And those are all the photographs that we kind of showed in the slideshow and showed in the book. And it was still stunning after 6 years of growth, almost sort of, I'm not going to say unmaintained because he does spend time in there, but kind of like unchecked in a regular garden way. So yeah, pretty impressed by that. Yeah, pretty happy with it.
Well, I think if you're using, local plants and in a local palette that's, in tune to soils and climate, etc., that I think shrublands could be fairly stable. But do you talk to your customers about, for example, fire adaptation? Like, do you recommend that they come and cut everything to the ground once every 5 years to kind of simulate a fire, or how do things go? Or have you had a chance to actually follow these gardens for 10 or 15 years out?
Yeah, no, I'd say that's probably the oldest one, would be the 2017 LA Wave installation. And that was kind of what we were going for this year when we went through and did like the hard coppicing on a lot of things, was really imitating that regime that they might go through kind of naturally. Excuse me.
And we have a couple questions. Let me start. I'll get to everybody. George asks if you know Olivier Philippi, known as the dry gardening guru, a pioneer of drought tolerant planting, and could you please comment on his work and yours?
We know of his work. We've communicated via email, but we've never seen it in person, and we've never met in person. But we share a publisher through Phil. We consider ourselves label mates of sorts. But yeah, I think the only comment I have on his work is that it's absolutely stunning, and we really found it inspirational, looked up to it strongly, and especially in the book. Michael mentioned it before, bringing the Mediterranean into your garden, that he wrote. That was a huge inspiration, I think, for us also writing this book, because we saw that he had unlocked so much depth and potential and thoughtfulness about the Mediterranean biome, like the OG Mediterranean biome, right? Like really where his focus is. And we wanted to expand that vision to shrublands kind of around the world, not only in like dry climates, but also showing that these exist in places where you necessarily wouldn't even think that they'd exist. Anything to add to that? No. I see a couple of questions in the chat. Maybe I'll just jump in about the sand planting. So there's a great book. It's by James Hitchmo. It's called Sowing Beauty, and it had come out, I think it was around maybe 2015, 2016. And it was about a lot of the work that Nigel Dunnett and Sarah Price had been doing throughout the UK. And the idea was that by creating this deep sand bed of around 3 to 4 inches, and then sowing seed directly onto the top of it, you could get these sort of naturalistic systems that both suppressed weeds and also created a slightly more extreme environment for England, because they wanted to bring in that were actually from the Mediterranean, and environments that would mimic those that England might experience through climate change, so that you get these gardens established now and kind of see them remain there into the future. So I really wanted to try a sand planting at that point, and that was the first sand garden that I had done. It predated some of the ones at Denver Botanic, and so that was the logic. I really just wanted to see what this style of planting would do in a Mediterranean climate like Los Angeles, and I wanted to try it for myself.
So can I interject here a question, a follow-up on that? Did you just put the sand on top of the existing soil, or did you do some removal and then lay the sand down?
No, the sod that was there, the turf layer, and some of the soil was removed down to the depth of about 3 inches, so we could fill that area up with the sand.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. And what I'll say is about that is it is effective over time. We found that in arid climates, the sand tends to be a little bit intense for that initial sowing. I think you get much less seedling recruitment, you say, as than you would in a wet climate. It really creates a very extreme condition. So the plants that you're growing, kind of the ones that you're planting, do have a chance to establish down into the subsoil. The sand does provide, I think, a little bit of like insulation from the top heat, but not much water retention at all. So the tougher shrubs can put their roots down through that. A lot of the annuals and perennials have a hard time establishing that top layer. So what I found at Denver Botanic in my sand planting was that it really tend to favor plants from more extreme environments. So moving further down into the desert Southwest than say things from the northern prairies.
Right. Well, maybe you just could adjust by using a shallower layer of sand. If you were trying to favor more of the somewhat more mesic as opposed to xeric species. Just depends on what you're trying to grow, right?
Definitely a possibility. And subsequent to those initial kind of sand plantings, we've had a pretty robust research program looking at actual alternative substrates rather than sand, right? So things that might have more so slightly different characteristics that are still going to have the weed suppression effect, but may retain a little bit more water for seedling recruitment, might have a little bit a different kind of particle size distribution and things like that. So we've actually found that alternate materiality in our climate in particular, I can't speak to California, is actually better. So things like decomposed granite, which have this kind of like particle size distribution from small pebbles all the way down to, of course, sand within that material, or crushed granite, have been superior products for a sowing mulch in the Intermountain West, at least.
Are you going to publish those results?
Yeah, eventually.
Good, good. We need that.
Did you catch somebody was asking if your if your book has a plant list for the LA Wave Garden?
The book doesn't have any plant lists in it. That was one of our intentions, was to try and not make it super specific to any place or region, but anywhere that there's a photo of LA Wave, and it does have its own full spread section, we list every plant that you can see in the photo.
Great. How about you mentioned rosemary and lavender as shrubs. What are some other edible shrubs you might recommend?
You want to go off?
Mix those in?
We did a whole presentation on this for a local community gardening group, and trying to convince them to replace water-hungry annual vegetables in our arid climate with these perennial deep-rooted shrubs. So we're passionate about it.
Yeah, we called the presentation "Scrumptious Urban Scrub." That was great.
Yeah. But yeah, there are a number of wonderful examples that go beyond seasonings and herbs. So big genus, it would be prunus. So all of those kind of stone fruit things tend to be these like colony forming rhizomatous shrubs. A plant that y'all might be familiar with, even on the West Coast, would be Atriplex or saltbush. So it's in the spinach family. So the entire plant is edible. You can coppice it down and it just pushes this like soft amaranth-like growth that can be eaten raw or whatever. If you think about all of the kind of brambles of the world, the rubus, the raspberries and blackberries and things like that, all of those are really kind of these woody shrubs or thicket forming species. I think the list goes on and on. We've talked about oaks, right? A long history of botanical uses. There's a lot of shrub oaks. Acorns are rich in energy. Like blanking
Yeah,
on. There's
ribes.
ribes,
Yeah,
currants.
Your currants
Yeah.
and gooseberries are incredible. Mahonias, the grape
Mahonia.
hollies are a
Yeah.
a great source of fruiting shrubs as well.
Yeah, fruiting
Yeah,
shrubs.
roses even.
Yeah.
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 So
There's a lot of untapped resources for fruit from native wild plants that we just haven't domesticated. Currants are a great example. Because I remember we had a neighbor that had a bush that was very prolific and they were very good. And I wish I'd taken a cutting because I've never found another one that was quite as sweet with the berries. So let me see if we have any other unanswered questions. A lot of comments about how inspiring and thought-provoking. It's definitely a different way of looking at things. And I would ask then if you're, oh, I did have one question. I saw it flash up on the screen. Can you explain bunneries?
Bunneries, yes. Bunneries are this sort of colloquial term for these mound forming or cushion forming plant communities. Tend to happen on like kind of wind blasted open plains on these really kind of shallow or strange depauperate substrates, or think the alpine tundra where stuff really can't put on very much biomass, but is constantly just buffeted by winds and ice and sleet and rain and hail. So the plant forms all sort of converge on this kind of mounding, Kevin called it a mycelia-like expanse, but they often form kind of these single taproot with these woody branches, but it just sort of looks like this bun or dome. And so we see these bunneries in these extreme habitats from our plains at 5,000 feet to our alpine tundra at 14,000 feet. So yeah, that's a bunnery.
Sounds like some of the plants that have adapted to the windswept Channel Islands out here, where
Totally.
Yeah.
dwarf forms
Yep.
of, of things like Artemisia californica
Yep.
goes sideways instead of up because of all the wind. So interesting.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
Yeah, we saw that in, was it, I think I said it wrong before, was it San Bruno Mountain?
San Bruno Mountain.
San Bruno Mountain, just south of San Francisco. And we did a hike there, and it was just incredible when you got onto that windward side of the mountain facing the coast. It was the forms of everything there were just so twisted and tight, and really kind of like the Eastern Tuckamore that you see, the shape, that coastal shaping.
Yeah.
We need to get more people to be appreciative of that sort of plant form and get those into our gardens. So thank you so much for the talk and the book. It was very thought-provoking. I love the paintings. I'm going to go out and look at my yard and see what it looks like with that kind of thought in mind. So thank you very much. It was wonderful to meet you, and hopefully I can get to the Denver Botanic Garden sometime.
Yeah, thank you all so much, and you're always welcome. Please let us know if you come out.
Yeah.
Terrific.
Thank you all.
Thank you so much. All right. Good night, everybody.
Good night, everyone.